The soft hum of the airport filled the air as passengers moved through the busy terminal, pulling their luggage behind them. The smell of freshly brewed coffee from a nearby cafe mixed with the scent of jet fuel, creating that unmistakable airport atmosphere. Among the travelers, Agent Marcus Carter walked confidently toward Gate 47. Dressed in a tailored navy blue suit, his polished leather shoes clicked lightly against the floor. He carried only a sleek, black briefcase, compact but professional. Marcus was a man who commanded attention, not because he sought it, but because his quiet confidence made people notice. At 6 feet 2 inches with a strong build, he looked like someone who knew how to handle himself. His deep brown eyes scanned the area as he approached the boarding line, always aware of his surroundings, a habit ingrained from years of fieldwork with the FBI. The first-class boarding announcement came over the loudspeaker. Marcus, holding a priority boarding pass, moved toward the jet bridge with ease. He nodded politely to the gate attendant, who smiled warmly. "Enjoy your flight, Mr. Carter," she said. "Thank you," he responded, his voice smooth yet firm. As he stepped onto the aircraft, the crisp, climate-controlled air of first class welcomed him. Plush, cream-colored leather seats, extra legroom, and the gentle hum of the plane's engine set the stage for a relaxing flight. The flight attendants bustled about, preparing drinks and offering warm towels to seated passengers. Marcus slid into his seat near the front of the cabin, setting his briefcase down by his feet. He took a breath, ready to enjoy a quiet trip, but fate had other plans. A few moments later, another first-class passenger stepped on board, and almost immediately, the energy shifted. A man in his late 50s, Richard Dawson, entered the cabin wearing a gray tailored suit, his gold wristwatch flashing under cabin lights. His silver-streaked hair was slicked back, and he walked with the air of someone who expected to be treated like royalty. As Dawson strolled toward his seat, his eyes landed on Marcus. His brow furrowed. His expression soured as if he had just found something unpleasant in his drink. At first, he didn't say anything. He simply stared, his lips pressing into a thin line. He took his seat 2 rows ahead of Marcus, but instead of settling in, he turned his head again, taking another long look at the black man behind him. His fingers drummed impatiently against the armrest. His jaw tightened. Then, with an exaggerated sigh, he flagged down a flight attendant. "Excuse me," Dawson said, loud enough for several nearby passengers to hear. "I believe there's been a mistake." The young flight attendant, a woman in her late 20s with a polite but professional demeanor, leaned in slightly. "A mistake, sir?" "Yes," Dawson said, nodding toward Marcus. "I believe this gentleman may have wandered into first class by accident." A hush fell over the nearby passengers. A few people exchanged glances, sensing the tension in the air. Marcus, who had been calmly adjusting his seatbelt, froze mid-motion. His eyes lifted, meeting Dawson's gaze. For a moment, there was silence. Then Marcus let out a small sigh. He had seen this type of behavior before, many times, and though it never surprised him, it never ceased to disappoint him either. He didn't react just yet. Instead, he simply observed. The flight attendant, caught off guard, offered a nervous smile. No, sir. Mr. Carter is a first-class passenger." She turned toward Marcus. "He's in his assigned seat." Dawson's eyes narrowed slightly. "Are you sure?" The condescension in his tone was unmistakable. The flight attendant, realizing what was happening, shifted uncomfortably. She knew better than to outright confront a passenger like Dawson, especially one who seemed to expect privilege. Marcus, still seated, raised an eyebrow. Finally, he spoke. "You seem very concerned about where I'm sitting," he said, his voice calm and even. Dawson let out a short, dry laugh. "Oh, no offense, of course. It's just, you don't exactly look like the typical first-class passenger." A small murmur spread through the cabin. A few passengers visibly stiffened. Marcus tilted his head slightly. He wasn't angry yet, but he was curious. "Oh," he said. "And what does a typical first-class passenger look like?" Dawson's lips pressed into a tight smirk. He didn't answer immediately. Instead, he shrugged and leaned back in his seat. "I was just making an observation," he muttered. The flight attendant looked flustered. She forced a smile and said, "Is there anything else I can help you with, sir?" Dawson waved a dismissive hand. "Just make sure we don't have any security risks on this flight." Marcus, still calm, exhaled slowly. He knew what was happening. He knew the type of man Dawson was. He had seen this game before. And yet, he said nothing for now. Instead, he settled into his seat, knowing that soon, things were about to take a very interesting turn. The hum of the airplane's air conditioning did little to cool the growing tension in first class. Passengers stole quick glances at the unfolding scene, some shifting uncomfortably in their seats while others leaned in, sensing drama. Richard Dawson, clearly not satisfied, sat stiffly in his seat. His nostrils flared as he continued to cast glances at Marcus. He tapped his fingers impatiently against the armrest before turning to the same flight attendant from earlier. "Listen," Dawson began, his voice sharper this time. "I don't want to make a big deal out of this, but I think it's best if we clarify things before takeoff." The flight attendant hesitated. "Sir, as I mentioned earlier, Mr. Carter is a first-class passenger. His boarding pass was checked, and he is seated correctly." Dawson exhaled dramatically. "That's not what I'm saying. I'm just saying in these times." He let out a forced chuckle. "You know, with all that's happening in the world, we should be extra careful about who sits where." The implication in his words was clear. Marcus let out a slow breath, his patience wearing thin. The flight attendant, now visibly uncomfortable, turned toward Marcus. "I'm very sorry, sir," she said softly, her eyes apologetic. "Would you mind showing your ticket again?" "Just to—" Marcus cut her off, his voice calm but firm. "I don't need to show my ticket again," he said, looking directly at Dawson. "I belong here. And you know it." Dawson scoffed, his arrogance on full display. "You know," Dawson said, crossing his arms, "I have plenty of friends in law enforcement. I could easily call security and have them do a background check on you." That was it. The moment that flipped the script. Marcus let out a small chuckle, shaking his head. "Is that so?" he asked, his voice carrying an amused edge. Dawson smirked. "That's right. People like me, we don't just sit back when we see something suspicious." The cabin grew dead silent. Marcus sighed, reached into his inner suit pocket, and pulled out a sleek, black leather wallet. With a deliberate motion, he flipped it open, revealing a gold badge with 3 unmistakable letters. FBI. Gasps filled the cabin. Dawson's face drained of color. His mouth opened, then closed, then opened again, like a fish gasping for air. Marcus let the badge sit in full view for a long moment before speaking again. His voice was low and steady, but there was an unmistakable power behind it. "You were saying?" Dawson blinked rapidly, his hands gripping the armrests as if he was trying to anchor himself to reality. What?" he stammered. You're an FBI agent." Marcus clicked his badge shut and slipped it back into his jacket. "That's right," Marcus said, his tone cool. "And I was actually planning to enjoy a quiet flight. But instead, I've had to sit here and listen to you question whether I belong in first class." Dawson's entire demeanor shifted. The smug arrogance drained from his expression, replaced by something new, pure, unfiltered panic. "I didn't mean anything by it," Dawson stuttered, suddenly shrinking in his seat. "It was just a misunderstanding." Marcus leaned in slightly, his eyes locking onto Dawson's. "Oh no," Marcus said smoothly. "You meant every word. But here's the thing, you picked the wrong guy to try this on." The murmurs in the cabin grew louder. Passengers whispered among themselves. Some even shook their heads at Dawson, disgusted by his behavior. The flight attendant straightened up, now emboldened by the turn of events. "Mr. Dawson," she said, regaining her professional composure, "since you seem uncomfortable with your seat, I'd be happy to see if there's an available seat in economy for you." Dawson's eyes widened. "WH what?" he stammered. No, that won't be necessary." Marcus chuckled. "Oh, but I think it is." The flight attendant nodded. "I'll check right away." Dawson slumped back into his seat, realizing there was no way out of this without further embarrassment. He had picked the wrong fight, and now everyone knew it. The plane's engines rumbled as it taxied toward the runway, but the real turbulence was still in the cabin. Richard Dawson sat rigidly in his seat, his face pale and stiff. He avoided eye contact with Marcus, his once confident demeanor now shattered. Marcus, on the other hand, had settled in comfortably, flipping open a book as if the last 10 minutes hadn't just exposed Dawson for the blatant racist he was. The flight attendant returned, her expression composed but her voice carrying an edge of satisfaction. "Well, Mr. Dawson," she said, "it turns out that economy is full. So it looks like you'll have to stay right where you are." Marcus smirked. He could almost hear the internal scream coming from Dawson's head. Dawson cleared his throat, trying to regain some dignity. That's fine. I just wanted to make sure everything was in order. Marcus didn't even look up from his book. Yeah, sure. The side-eye from nearby passengers was relentless. The businessman sitting across the aisle shook his head in disapproval. The elderly woman a few rows up gave Dawson a disgusted glance before turning back to her knitting. Even the teenage girl in row 3 whispered to her mother loud enough for Dawson to hear. That guy is so embarrassing. Dawson shifted uncomfortably. He was used to being the one in control, the one whose voice mattered. But now he was the guy who got owned by the FBI agent in first class. The captain's voice came over the intercom. Ladies and gentlemen, we've been cleared for takeoff. Flight attendants, please prepare for departure. As the plane lifted into the sky, Marcus leaned his head back, ready to enjoy the flight. Dawson, however, was still fuming. He wasn't done yet. As the plane climbed to cruising altitude, the tension in the cabin hadn't fully dissipated. Dawson sat stiffly, his fingers drumming anxiously against the armrest. His initial plan to get Marcus thrown out of first class had backfired spectacularly, but he wasn't the kind of man to let things go so easily. He needed to regain control. His eyes flickered toward the flight attendants, who were now preparing the beverage cart. With a fake air of politeness, he leaned toward the lead attendant, the same one who had already shut him down before. Dawson whispering, "I need to speak with the captain." Privately, the flight attendant raised an eyebrow. "Sir, unless it's an emergency, the captain is not available for casual conversations." Dawson forced a tight-lipped smile. "It is an emergency. It's about security concerns. I know what I'm talking about." He gave her a pointed look, as if expecting her to understand. The flight attendant hesitated, but finally sighed. "All right, sir. I'll inform the captain." Marcus, still seated calmly, had heard the entire exchange. He didn't need to look up from his book to know that Dawson was up to something. A few minutes later, the cockpit door opened, and the captain, a tall, no-nonsense woman in her early 50s, stepped into the cabin. Her name tag read Captain Helen Carter. She walked directly to Dawson, arms crossed. "Captain Carter, I was informed you have a security concern, mister." Dawson straightened his tie, forcing his most authoritative tone. "Dawson, yes, Captain. I believe there's a situation that needs to be addressed." That man, gesturing toward Marcus, "I'm not entirely convinced of his credentials. He claims to be FBI, but let's be honest. Anyone can flash a badge these days." Captain Carter's expression didn't change. She turned her gaze toward Marcus. "Sir, do you mind showing me your credentials?" Without a word, Marcus coolly reached into his suit pocket and pulled out his FBI badge again, flipping it open with a practiced motion. But this time he also revealed his agency-issued ID card, which bore his full name, division, and security clearance level. Captain Carter took one look at it, and her expression immediately shifted. Captain Carter, reading Special Agent Marcus Reynolds. Counterterrorism Division. The moment she said it, the air seemed to change. Several nearby passengers turned their heads, their eyes widening in surprise. Marcus, completely unfazed, offered the captain a slight nod. "That's correct, ma'am." Dawson, however, was now visibly sweating. He had no idea that Marcus was that high up. Captain Carter snapped the ID shut and turned back to Dawson. Her voice was firm. "Sir, I don't appreciate passengers trying to create unnecessary disturbances based on personal biases. Agent Reynolds is exactly who he says he is, and I won't tolerate further harassment on my aircraft." Dawson gulped. His face turned red. Passengers around him murmured in hushed voices. The businessman across the aisle let out a low chuckle, and the elderly woman up front gave a satisfied nod. Dawson's jaw clenched. His plan had failed again. But this time, he wasn't just embarrassed, he was angry. He wasn't done yet. Dawson's hands clenched into fists as Captain Carter walked away, leaving him humiliated in front of the entire first-class cabin. His mind raced, his ego refusing to accept defeat. He glanced at Marcus, who had calmly returned to his book, completely unfazed by the entire ordeal. That infuriated Dawson even more. His heart pounded with frustration. His mind screamed for retaliation. And then a dangerous idea formed. He turned to the flight attendant nearest to him. Dawson whispering, "You need to check his belongings." The attendant gave him a blank stare. "Excuse me?" Dawson, leaning in, voice lower, "I saw him acting suspicious. He might be carrying something dangerous. You never know these days." The flight attendant recoiled slightly, her expression shifting to one of pure disbelief. "Flight attendant, sir, I strongly suggest you stop these baseless accusations before you." Dawson cut her off, his voice rising in fake urgency. "Dawson, I'm telling you, this is about passenger safety. What if he's—" Marcus suddenly snapped his book shut. The sound echoed through the cabin. Slowly, he turned his head toward Dawson. His eyes were cold, unreadable. The entire plane seemed to hold its breath. Then, in a tone as calm as it was deadly serious, he spoke. "Marcus, Mr. Dawson, do you realize what you just did?" Dawson opened his mouth to speak, but Marcus didn't let him. "Marcus," voice unwavering, "you just made a false accusation about a federal agent on an aircraft. Do you understand the consequences of that?" A single beat of silence. Dawson swallowed hard. The businessman across the aisle let out a low whistle. The elderly woman up front shook her head. Marcus leaned in slightly, his voice dropping to a near whisper. "Marcus, do you know what happens to people who lie about national security threats on a flight, Mr. Dawson?" Dawson froze. His breathing grew uneven. Passengers around them murmured in hushed voices. Then, before Dawson could stammer out a response, Marcus reached into his inner suit pocket, the movement smooth, practiced, and pulled out his phone. With one tap, he held it up so Dawson could see. On the screen, a direct dial to the TSA and the Department of Homeland Security. Marcus didn't break eye contact. "Marcus, one word from me, and we land this plane immediately. You'll be taken off in handcuffs and charged under federal law for making a false report. I hope you enjoy explaining that to a judge." Dawson's face drained of all color. He suddenly looked small, weak. For the first time, true fear flickered in his eyes. The flight attendant stepped in. "Sir, I think it's best if you remain silent for the rest of the flight." Marcus held his gaze for a moment longer. Then, as if Dawson was no longer worth his time, he calmly put his phone away and returned to his book. The entire first-class cabin broke into quiet applause. Dawson, humiliated beyond belief, sank into his seat, too terrified to say another word. As the flight neared its destination, the lead flight attendant approached Marcus with an apologetic smile. "Flight attendant, Agent Reynolds, on behalf of the airline, I sincerely apologize for this disturbance." Marcus nodded. "Not your fault. Some people just can't help themselves." She hesitated, then smirked. "You know, we do have a policy about disruptive passengers. If you'd like, we can have airport security escort Mr. Dawson for a chat the moment we land." Dawson's eyes snapped wide open. Marcus barely looked up. He simply smirked. "Marcus, no need. I think he's learned his lesson." But then he turned his gaze toward Dawson one last time. His expression hardened. "Marcus, haven't you?" Dawson nodded furiously, sweat dripping from his brow. Dawson stammering, "What? Of course. No problems here." Satisfied, Marcus gave a small nod and went back to his book. The flight attendant chuckled, then walked away, leaving Dawson in absolute silence. The plane touched down minutes later. As passengers gathered their belongings, Dawson didn't move. He waited until nearly everyone had left before finally slipping out, his head low, his confidence shattered, and his arrogance utterly destroyed. Meanwhile, Marcus Reynolds walked off the plane like nothing had happened. Just another day in the life of a man who knew exactly who he was.